So welcome to everybody. I will get rid of myself and Paul is going to take over.
Okay, thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to ask everybody to mute them, every non-speaker, please mute yourselves so that there's no interruptions in that regard. That is being recorded. Thank you. I'm Paul Bellinger. I'm on the advisory board for Quimper Geological Society. People keep asking me, I'm on Whitby, what's Quimper? People don't know what Quimper is. Manuel Quimper discovered the Port Townsend Peninsula 2 years before Vancouver in 1790, and that's why it's named after him, basically. But thanks for coming to the Quimper Geological Society's first successful recording lecture. It was done 4 weeks ago in person, and we had a hiccup. So Dr. Brian Sherrod, that I'll introduce momentarily, has graciously agreed to do it again. Um, we will, in addition to today, check our website for future talks. Ralph Hagerud is here on April 20th, and that's going to be to speak about the glacial landscape of Puget Sound. Won't miss that one. It's in person only at the First Baptist Church in Port Townsend. It will be recorded for later. It's not going to be simulcast. Okay, so I've known Brian. I moved here 5 years ago from Colorado, and I first met Dr. Sherrod at Soundwater's Stewards spring or fall talks that he gives every year to our organization, Soundwater Stewards. And so I invited him to come here for this year, and let's welcome him, U.S. Geological Research Geologist from Seattle. His lecture is entitled New Findings of Earthquakes of Salish Lowland with Pre-Analysis. He'll discuss new evidence for multi-fault rupture that occurred along the Seattle Saddle Mountains in winter of 923, 924 CE. And CE, it replaces ED without any religious connotations. This project took more than 5 years of research and a large team of geologists to determine the date. And he'll explain how they know the exact year and even a suggestion of the season. Their work including studying tree rings for traces of ancient solar storms. Geologists now have a better understanding that a slip on one fault may increase stress on others that are nearby. That's maybe a no-brainer in some ways, but it's hard to pin it down. Brian will also present group evidence of the 1830s earthquake on the Seattle Fault, as well as talk about the recurrence of large earthquakes in the Salish Lowland. Many Washingtonians fear the big one, as Puget Sound region is prime for a large magnitude earthquake, and the media makes a lot of hay about that. Understanding their frequency of occurrences allows for a better understanding of future earthquake risk. In this talk, Brian relies on photographs, USGS mapping, LiDAR measurements, charts, and graphs to elaborate his points. Brian will explain how this important event was detected and why this new understanding is important. And he's very eloquent. He's very much down to earth and speaking to for people to understand. He's a project chief and Pacific Northwest Regional Coordinator for the U.S. Geological Survey Earthquake Hazards Program, based out of the Department of Earth and Sciences at University of Washington. And I just graduated from University of Washington 50 years ago to the day last Friday from my bachelor's in geology. He received his bachelor's in geology, though. This is Brian, from James Madison University in Virginia, his MS in geology from the University of Pittsburgh, and his PhD in geological sciences from the UW, University of Washington. His main area of research is paleoseismology, finding evidence of path earthquakes in the Pacific Northwest using geological records. His recent projects include working on evidence for surface rupture along faults in central and western Washington, coastal uplift and subsidence along faults in northern Puget Sound, and uplift along the coast of southeast Alaska. Much of his work employs a relatively new technology of airborne laser survey, LiDAR. below are the most, well, yeah. Let's me turn it over and welcome Brian Sherrod. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. And thank you for having me back. And so I'm going to get started here in just a second. I'll start sharing. And while I do that, hopefully it will work. Um, I'll just briefly just tell you. So I gave this this talk a couple of weeks ago, and I I never like to do the same thing again. So I've changed it up a little bit. I'm going to do basically some talk about the high resolution dating that we've done, and the Seattle fault work that we're working on. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about a fault in your backyard, the North Olympics fault, which I didn't talk about last time. So we'll go ahead and get started. And if you've got questions, like I said, you can put them in the chat, and Paul and Carol will look at them and decide whether or not we can interrupt and cover it then, or whether we should wait. Hang on one sec. There we go. So we'll get started. If you can see my laser pointer there.
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So a short roadmap of what we're going to cover, and just real general what we'll talk about. I'm going to call this basically three main topics: the high resolution dating of a series of earthquakes on the Seattle and Saddle Mountain faults. And I personally don't know of any earthquake sequence, paleo earthquake sequence, that's been dated with this kind of precision, but maybe there is. But these this is very unique study in terms of the high resolution dating we've been able to get to date these earthquakes. And so I'll talk about that. The paper is freely available online, and I'll show you where you can get that during the talk. After I do that, we'll talk about some new evidence for a very young earthquake on the Seattle fault. We think it occurred in the 1830s. It certainly was post 1,000 years ago. And we'll talk a little bit about that and what we've done on that. And then, like I said, last, I'm going to talk about the North Olympics fault zone, which is, if you're in Port Townsend right now, or if you're on the Olympic Peninsula, it basically runs just south of Port Townsend and Port Angeles, paralleling the Straits of Juan de Fuca. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to keep this at a pretty high level, but if you want me to get into the weeds, just raise your hand and ask a question and we'll go. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start. So the first thing I just want to show you is just a general map of the Puget Lowland. This is a map and a slide that I put together for a talk I'm going to give at a meeting up in Anchorage in about a month. And it's just to show you that, you know, if you think about the Salish Lowland where we live, basically within that white dash box, we can think about, you know, we've got about 9 active fault zones within that, 9 or 10, depending on how you group them within that box. And we know that now because since the early 1990s, we've done a lot of work, and you can see all the site totals on the right in the legend. We've done a lot of work at a bunch of different sites to characterize the activity of these faults and to see, kind of determine how big the earthquakes can be produced on these faults and how often they occur. And I'm not going to get into too deep in some of that research, but I'll brush on it, at least on the 2 main fault zones we're going to talk about. So we're going to spend the next probably 20-30 minutes talking about the Seattle fault zone. And it's basically, this slide, you know, is, I think, an excellent place to start, because this is where it all started. And when I say where it all started, what happened is back in the late 80s, early 90s, a group of geologists working in the region noticed this very conspicuous platform that rings parts of southern Puget Sound. And this is the southern end of Bainbridge Island at Restoration Point. That point, right here, this point, Restoration Point, is sticking out into Puget Sound from the west, pointing towards Seattle, behind the image behind me, basically. And the inlet on the right, that's Blakely Harbor, and this is Rich Passage over here that leads to Bremerton. And so what you're looking at here is you're looking at an island that is surrounded by a low platform, and that is surrounded again by this intertidal wave cut platform out in the modern intertidal zone. The water is at low tide in this image, and you can see the white beach sand that's piled up around the high water line. And so when the tides are up, the water's up here, tides are down, the water's out here. And it planes off this nice flat planar wave cut platform in the intertidal zone. What happened is we now know in the winter of 923, 924 CE, it's the Common Era. So basically 1,027 years ago, there was a big earthquake on the Seattle Fault, which, one of the strands the main strand runs just off the right of this image. And when the earthquakes occur on this fault, it lifts up the area to the south of the fault strand, and the area to the north of the fault strand subsides. And so you're looking at the uplifted block of the Seattle Fault Zone that got uplifted during this big calamitous earthquake about 1,000 years ago. And this planar feature you see, this is the paleo, the former intertidal platform that formed prior to uplift. So the high tide line used to be up here, and then it was uplifted, and here's the modern high tide line. And so the difference between the modern high tide line and the tide line that was 1,000 years ago is at this particular site about 7 meters. All right, so that's 20 some feet. And so in an instant, when I say in an instant, in a minute or 2 minutes, during some really severe shaking, if you were being thrown around on the ground out there during this earthquake, you could have looked up and literally watched the ground lift up and stay there after this earthquake. And so that's the kind of event we're talking about. And so this is where it all started. And the guy that I used to work for, one of Michael Machette's former colleagues, Bob Bucknam, he hired me to start working with him on characterizing this fault and other faults in the Puget Lowland in terms of their past activity. And so this was kind of the first paper. This is the title page and the first figure in this paper that's published in Science in 1992, December of 1992. And Bob Bucknam was the lead author. Eileen Hempel-Haley and Estella Leopold were the co-authors. And what they documented in this and a series of other papers that were published with it, I think it was 5 other papers, is documenting this big earthquake on the Seattle Fault Zone. It was the first big shallow earthquake that we knew about in the Puget Lowland. The first one we'd ever found. And so this is the paper that documented it. And I think you can probably go to Science and download this freely as well. So Bob, this is figure 1. This map is figure 1 of that paper. And it documents the uplift and all of the radiocarbon ages along the Seattle Fault Zone. But Bob was really good about, he worked in a lot of different areas down by, the south area down, west of Tacoma, over by Belfair, and then over in the Olympics. And basically, he made note of all these things that he thought could have been the result of past earthquakes, and they'd been dated, and he indicates the dates on the map here and their locations. And he didn't quite know what to make of these things when he made this map, but he just knew that, hey, well, this is pretty interesting. They're all happening at about the same time as this big earthquake on the Seattle Fault. Well, so we've gone over the past 25 years or so, we've spent a lot of time and have gone to a lot of different sites and have done a lot of work. And we now know that these big purple dashed lines are places where we have active fault zones within the southern Puget Lowland. And we've done enough work on these to know when they last ruptured and how big the ruptures were. And one of the most interesting things of this whole story is if you take and you look at the data between the Seattle Fault, the Saddle Mountain Faults, the Tacoma Fault right here, and the Olympia structure down the southernmost structure in the lowland. If you look at the paleo earthquake information from those 4 faults, what you're struck with is that about 1,000 years ago, between 900 and 930 CE, there was an earthquake. We think there was an earthquake on every single one of those structures, and it all occurred in terms of our best available radiocarbon dating, it all occurred at the same time. We cannot tell them apart. No matter how hard we squeeze that data, they just always seem to fall within this time interval right here. And so we've we commonly attributed that to a number of different things that could have happened 1,000 years ago. But basically, was either one big event, which is a really interesting would be a really interesting event, or a series of closely spaced events, in time. So I think Bob used to call it a decade of terror or a year of hell, something like that. And so we're just trying to figure out exactly what happened during this interval. And so this is something that I actually did part of my dissertation on back a long time ago in the mid-90s. And so this problem has sat here like this for 25 years, and we've just not made any progress on it. And it was kind of frustrating. And so at present, we can't really figure this out using traditional radiocarbon approaches. And so we've got to really start thinking outside the box. What are we going to do? The easiest method to use, the most direct method to use to do this, is if you can use dendrochronology. And that's a method where you're using tree ring dating, counting tree ring widths, and you're correlating these tree rings over a region and getting a master chronology that you can count back in time with. We could use that, but it's just a lot of work, and you've got to get lucky to find the right samples to do it with. And so, we just haven't made any progress on this. I put this middle sentence in there: serendipity, the faculty or phenomenon of finding valuable or agreeable things, not sought for. So this whole project, Paul said it started, over 5 years ago. That's about right, 2018, I believe. I was at a landslide meeting in Eugene, Oregon. And I was sitting at the end of the table, and this really nice guy next to me, his name was Brian Black, was sitting next to me, and we started chatting. I'd never met him before. We just started talking. He's a dendrochronologist. And at the end of the meeting, I leaned over to him and I said, have I got a project for you? And we just started talking, and it's grown to be a really profitable and agreeable collaboration over the years, and we're still working together. We got a lot of really cool projects going on. So I'm gonna show you kind of what we worked on to publish this paper on these high resolution ages on these earthquakes. So you don't tend to think about this very often, but we find fossil wood everywhere. Brian Black, he's dealt with fossil wood his entire career, and he is absolutely floored by how much fossil wood there is in abundance in the Pacific Northwest. We just never realize it. It's everywhere. You just got to go out and work to get it. And so that's essentially what we did. This picture is a picture of Price Lake over by Lake Cushman. And those things sticking up out of the water, those are in situ fossil tree stumps that have rotted off at the lake level. And we're going to talk about some of the samples that we used in this study. So some of the other samples we use, I'm just going to show you some places you can go and you can find some of this wood and what you can do with it. So one of the first samples that we used that Brian Atwater collected as part of this series of science papers in 1992, he collected a log out of a tsunami deposit at the West Point sewage treatment plant when they were constructing it back in the late 80s, early 90s. And we call it the sewer log right here, the sewer log. And it lays in this sand sheet deposit between these two intertidal deposits that they found in an excavation at the West Point sewage treatment plant. Brian interpreted the sand sheet as a tsunami deposit that was basically sand deposits and material that were entrained in a slurry and deposited on land from a tsunami wave that washed ashore. And that tsunami wave was triggered by the uplift, the abrupt uplift that I showed you a picture of the uplifted platform at Restoration Point was triggered by that earthquake. And so we've got this log that was deposited in the tsunami that was triggered by the earthquake. And he surmised that the log hadn't been laying around on the ground before it was entrained in the tsunami deposit because it still had all of its bark on it. So it was a good fresh log that we could work with. And Brian, great scientist. Brian took a sample of this thing and he kept it archived for all these years. And we were able to actually go back and resample it. So, it's just one of those things. It's just really good science. And so to the right here's a picture of the tsunami deposit up at Coltis Bay, the very south end of Whidbey Island, where it's facing to the south. And the tsunami wave ran up into Coltis Bay. And this is the deposit that it left after it washed ashore in the former marsh and then left its deposit behind. So that's basically the same thing that he found at West Point. Another site that we're working on right now, I'm not going to show you any data from this, but it's just to show you that, here's what some of these sites look like. Little Skookum Inlet, which is one of those fingers that sticks off, the southernmost fingers that stick off to the southwest, just west of Olympia, the southernmost part of the Salish Lowland, Salish Sound. And so you're looking at, this is Little Skookum Inlet, and this is Highway 101 over here. McCleary is just off to the upper left. And so this is the tide flat at low tide. We're going to zoom in on this part of the tide flat, and you can see these little peninsulas of salt marsh that are sticking out that are presently being eroded by the tides as sea level rises. So here are those little peninsulas of salt marsh that I told you about, some little islands that are left. So this used to all be covered by salt marsh, and it's been dissected and eroded as sea levels rose in the late Holocene. And what I want to key in on this is just a Google image. I just clipped it out of Google. You can go there and look for higher resolution if you want. But around these islands and around the little peninsula, you can see all this white stuff in the image. There's a white sticks laying there. There's a bunch of white stuff here all around here. Well, those are these things here. So these are two pictures from around the peninsula and islands in Skookum Inlet. And what's eroding out, this is an old forest floor that is being eroded and exposed and re-exposed, and it's buried beneath the salt marsh here. You can see a tree stump eroding out from beneath the modern and the former tide flat deposits and tidal deposits. And so essentially what you've got here is a former forest floor that we think subsided during an earthquake or during some kind of event about 1,000 years ago, and was buried by intertidal muds, lower intertidal muds, and salt marsh deposits. And so these are in situ. These are in growth position. They're not just flotsam that is deposited there. These things, to get them out, you got to dig them out. So they are rooted in their original growth position. Here at Red Salmon Creek over at the Nisqually, the eastern part of the Nisqually River Delta, easternmost. Here you can see the creek at low tide level. And then along the banks, you can see these in situ cedar and Douglas fir stumps. And there's outcrops that just go on and on along this creek that show this same relationship, where there's a bunch of in situ tree stumps that are buried again by intertidal tide flat deposits and salt marsh deposits. Again, these things all date to that very narrow interval of time 1,000 years ago. So this is all part of that same event that I've been describing. So here's one of the sites that we studied. This is Price Lake. Here's the lake. The picture I showed you initially when I showed you the trees sticking up out of the lake, that was taken from here and looking out over here in the lake. And you can see the lake's location over here by Lake Cushman and over kind of in the southeast foothills of the Olympic Mountains. And a big map fault runs right through the area, basically runs right here. You're looking at the fault scarp basically right here and runs across the outlet right about there. And so this is a LiDAR image of the same area. Here's Price Lake, here's Lake Cushman. And here is that fault that I was telling you about that's mapped that runs across the outlet of the lake. So I'm going to back up real quick. So this is a LiDAR image. It's basically a laser altimetry image collected from an airplane. And this is a slope. It's called a slope map. And the way to look at these, you'll see some of more of these later on, which is why I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain these. You'll see these later on. The way that I do these is you're looking at the slope of the landscape with flat areas. So the water is perfectly flat. Those are white. So the lighter colored areas on this image are flatter areas, and the darker colored areas, like along the fault here and along the mountainsides, those are steeper slope, steeply sloping. And if it's an absolute black, black color, then it's you could be close to vertical. And you'll see more of these later on. So just keep that in mind. So Price Lake is an awesome place to go if you're interested in learning about earthquakes, because here we have a lake that was created when this fault scarp ruptured the ground surface and broke up through the drainage system here. This creek used to drain all the way through here, and here's the headwaters here, Cargill Creek and this other creek over here. And it drained on through here. And when the scarp popped up, this scarp right here is 8 meters tall, 25 feet. When this thing popped up, it blocked the drainage and impounded this whole area and created this lake. And so those are those trees that you saw sticking up out of the water. And so here's some of the images from Price Lake. We constructed a platform using canoes with 2x4s and and plywood to put our hydraulic chainsaw. This is a chainsaw that you can use underwater. Hydraulic chainsaw and a dive team came out, and we collected some of these trees, cut slices off of some of these trees, and brought them ashore and took them back, dried them out, and worked on them. And so here's the team, dive team. There's a tree that was sitting up and fell over after the scarp was formed, and they've cut a slab out of that, and the slab came from right here. Here they are working on a tree. You can see the tree sticking up through the water here. They're getting ready to go down and cut a piece off of that. And then you can see they're actually here stirring up a bunch of mud, cutting a big chunk out of this tree right here. And so here's again an aerial image of the platform with all these trees sticking up out of the bottom of the lake. And these trees are again in situ and were killed in place after the scarp popped up and created the lake. So the trees give us a really good idea, or can give us a really good idea of when the earthquake occurred if we can get a really accurate age on the trees, because they were killed by the earthquake. So here's a picture of the dive team. He's using the hydraulic chainsaw to cut a slab off this gigantic Doug fir. Here's the slab when they're done. This is one of the slabs we took back to the lab, and you can see they're all happy. They really worked hard to get these samples. At times, Pete was telling me that at times he was completely below the mud surface with the saw cutting. So it was a pretty intense field project. So here's another sample of a tree that was dredged from the bottom of Lake Washington. It was also in situ, and it was pulled up by a dredge team under the auspices of potentially logging these trees for sale. And the guy got caught, and Gordon Jacoby and Pat Williams came out from Lamont Daughtery and collected samples of the trees. And actually, we got those samples from Lamont and used them as part of this study as well. So here, Pat Williams said that this tree died 1,100 years plus or minus 150 radiocarbon years BP. And I scratched that out and I said, nope, it died in the winter of 923, whoops, 924. I messed that up because this is one of the samples that we actually used in the study, and the outermost ring dates to 923, 924. Here's some more trees. You can see this little red box. This is Lake Sammamish at Greenwood Point. So it's kind of the southernmost part of Lake Sammamish. And you can see in this red box, these little dark things sticking up out of the water surface. Those are tree stumps. And here's one of them right here off the side of my kayak, sticking up out of about 50, 60 feet of water. So most of the tree is still there. It's just rotted off where it's exposed to the air. Below the water surface, it's still pretty well preserved. And you can see a slab of one of these trees here in the bottom. So what did we do? So we went and collected a bunch of samples from a handful of sites. I think there were 6 sites in total that we used, and we really focused on a handful of those sites. But we did multiple samples from each of those sites, And they all were treated the same. Basically, you take the samples, get them back to the lab, you dry them, you mount them on a piece of wood, and you sand and polish them to where they're basically no scratches or anything. It looks like a very polished mirror surface to work on. And you can measure the rings. They measure the ring widths under magnification with a calibrated microscope stage and software that records the widths of each ring as you traverse across the sample. And optionally, and this is typically the way it's done now, I think it's just easier and automated, is you can take the prep samples and scan them in a calibrated scanner at very high resolution. And the ring widths are digitally measured, automated, using an algorithm. And we did both in this study. Most of the preliminary work is done manually, and then a lot of the follow-up work is done optically using the scan samples. So what we do, or what Brian Black did, and his team, is we collected these samples, and here's a diagram, kind of a common diagram for dendrochronology. You get these samples, and you don't know how these trees relate to each other, if they even do, and how they relate to each other in time. And so you take samples of the ring series from each sample, and you measure them, count them, and you get a curve like this. This is basically normalized ring widths through the sample. And then you start kind of sliding these things back and forth, kind of like a bar chart, and until they match up. And then there are formal statistical ways of doing this, where you can test the strength of the match. But when they match up, you can start building this ring chronology up through time, where here's the oldest sample, 1785 out here. And then here's the youngest sample up here, which was the felling year, okay? And you can then count and figure out how many years was involved. And if you know if you're able to correlate this with a tree that you know when it was killed, and you have the outermost ring, you can actually count back and figure out the exact year that the trees were killed, which is essentially what we did. So here's a kind of three of our best samples from the Seattle Fault, Saddle Mountain Fault system. So samples that came from Lake Washington, Lake Sammamish, the sewer log over at Discovery Discovery Park, the West Point sewer log, and then trees from Hamma Delta, where the Hamma River comes out in the Hood Canal, and trees that those were killed by a big landslide that came down, we think, during that big earthquake, and then trees that were killed in Price Lake by the fault rupture on the Saddle Mountain Fault. And so there's three of these guys: Lake Washington, Price Lake, and Hamma shown here. And the correlations, there they are. You'll just have to kind of take my word for it. That's a really good correlation. And Brian was amazed at how well these things correlated. And essentially, they all died at the same year, and they all died in the same part of the same year. So they basically died in the winter of whatever year it was they died. They died in the winter because they had a full early growth ring and a full late wood, but no early wood from the next year. So that means they died in the late fall, winter of whatever year they died in, and they all died in the same season of the same year. And so we knew that they died at the same time. They all correlated together. They were killed presumably during this one big event. We just didn't know when that was. So we needed to come up with a way to get when that year was. And there's two ways we did it. We used very ultra high resolution radiocarbon dating, which I'm going to get in here with these Miyake events. And then we also used traditional dendrochronological methods, using a very long master chronology that we were able to pull out of archive and put to use. And I'll show you what we did here in just a second here. So these Miyake events that I'm talking about, so we were able to leverage this fairly recent phenomenon that this fellow Fusa Miyake, Japanese physicist, found, where there are very rapid and short-lived bursts of production of cosmogenic isotopes in the atmosphere by interaction of neutrons and cosmic radiation. So what that means in a nutshell is that there was either a burst of a solar flare on our sun or a solar flare on a nearby star that caused a very rapid, short-lived burst of radiation into our atmosphere. And what that did over a 1 to 2 year period of time is it produced a very quick burst of radiocarbon, carbon-14 in the atmosphere that was then assimilated by all the plants and animals and became part of the radiocarbon reservoir that we rely on for radiocarbon dating. And so what that looks like is, let me walk you through this, what we do to use these things. So we have a ring series. So here's one of the ring series. You can see these chunks that were sliced out of it in 3 or 4 different places. And so you have a ring series, and you take that ring series, you cut it out, and then you dissect it under the microscope. And what that means is you take a razor blade and you cut each little slice of each ring out, and you take, and that's a sample, and then you take that individual ring slice, and if you did this entire series, you get radiocarbon samples on each ring that you then use to figure out what the concentration of delta carbon-14 is in the sample. And so what I mean by a Miyake event is, here's the radiocarbon production, which would be typical. And the Miyake event, this short burst of solar radiation coming into the atmosphere, causes that production to rapidly increase. And then it falls back down to the normal rate of production pretty quickly. And so this, when a graph doesn't look like much, this is a big time, like one of a kind that we know about, burst of radiocarbon production in the atmosphere. This is the original Miyake event, the Miyake event that occurred in 774 CE. And this is what Husa Miyake wrote his Nature paper on when he discovered these things. There's now a whole bunch of these things. Let me go back. There's a whole bunch of these things known: 993 CE, 774, 660, basically 5000 BCE, and then 7000 BCE. We're using, I think it's this one right now. We are trying to get a single year age for the Mazama eruption using wood that was killed by the Mazama eruption. And so these are very useful events for us because they give us the opportunity to find these things in tree samples. And then once you found this thing, you know the year that occurred, and then you can count out to when your tree was killed, and you've got the death age. And so in our sample, we know the trees all died together, and all of the ring series, Miyake event ring series analyses we did came up with the exact same thing right here. Here's all of our samples. We identified it in all of our samples. And that gives us, we identified the ring that is 774 based on that analysis. And we count out and we find that the trees all died in the year of 923, 924 CE. Again, they've got the early wood, they've got a full late wood, but they don't have any early wood from the next year. And so we think it was a winter of 923, 924 death for all of these trees. We were also able to leverage a previously unknown, sampled but unknown, it was unpublished, was collect a sample of trees that were collected up on Vancouver Island. It's called the Mac-Blow Forest, Mac-Blow chronology. Gordon Jacoby, a very famous dendrochronologist at Lamont Doherty back in New York, he collected it in 1991, but he never published it, and he died, and he never published it. But they had the samples and they had his data back at Lamont, and we got the samples, and Brian prepped them and counted them up. And so we now have a master chronology from Douglas Fir that goes from 715 CE to 990 CE. So we've got a full, historic to prehistoric master chronology, continuous, using these trees from the Mac-Blow forest for us to compare with. And so what Brian did, I won't get into all the nitty-gritty details here, but what Brian did is he took the ring series from the Seattle Fault and Saddle Mountain Fault system and compared them with the MAC below, and he got the same answer using the traditional dendrochronology as he did with the Miyake events, is that all of these trees died in the year 923, 924 CE. So we've dated all these samples using two different independent techniques, and we get the same answer. And so what it points to is that the Seattle Fault ruptured in this big, gigantic earthquake. We think it was a magnitude 7.5-ish earthquake. And within us, either at the same time or within a 6-month period of time, the Saddle Mountain Fault ruptured in about the same size earthquake. So it was either a big event that could have been, if you add the moments up together, could have been up to a magnitude 7.7, 7.8 earthquake, or it was a 1-2 event of a magnitude 7.4 and a magnitude 7.5. Take your pick. It's a bad scenario. Okay. And so that's what we've done, is we've dated these two earthquakes in our backyards, and they all date to basically the same period of time. And like I said earlier, I don't know of two paleo earthquakes that have been dated with this kind of precision. So I just think that it's a really unique study, and I was just glad to be part of it. So if you're interested, you can go to just Google Science Advances multi-fault earthquake, and you'll pop up the page, and you can download the paper. It's free because we paid to have it downloadable for everybody to get a hold of. Okay, so if you're interested, download the paper, read it. All of the gory details are there and in the electronic supplement. So what happened during these earthquakes? All right, so on we had the big rupture on the Seattle Fault Zone. We had at same season, either at the same time or within a 6-month period of time, we had a big rupture on the Saddle Mountain Fault. And then around the same time, we're working on trying to get the calendrical age of this right now. We also had a really big earthquake on the Tacoma Fault. And at about the same time, all of these trees down here in the southern Puget Lowland, all those guys died. And we know that there was shaking that accompanied the submergence of those trees. And so we've got a lot going on right around the same time. What happened? So here is a profile collected from the LIDAR across basically this profile here from the shoreline of what happened to the shoreline during these events. It got uplifted and folded into a big Holocene anticline. And so there was about 14 meters of slip on the Seattle Fault that resulted in a big, broad anticline of the shorelines. Basically, it folded the surface above the buried fault tip. And so the uplift here is about up to 8 meters, almost 10 meters in places. And I can't see the scale here because it's covered up by oh, there it is. This is 60 kilometers along the axis here. So this thing's about 15 to 20 kilometers broad, north to south. So it's a pretty big feature. And so when you're out on the water in central Puget Sound and you look at the coastline, you see this flat feature right above the shoreline. That's usually what you're looking at, is this uplifted anticline. We go down to the Tacoma Fault down here along these areas here and along Hood Canal. The Tacoma Fault ruptured, had about 13 meters of displacement, and resulted in the same kind of deal, a big uplifted anticline along the north side of the Tacoma Fault. And so you've got these two big anticlines forming roughly at the same time, 1,000 years ago. And then over here on the Southeast Olympics, you've got this fault that ruptured with up to an 8-meter tall, tall fault scarp. And so all of this happened over a pretty short period of time. So it's a pretty energetic period of time in terms of earthquake activity. And we are still in the process of working on getting ages on the Tacoma Fault and ages on this stuff down here in southern Puget Sound, but we're really close. We just got some samples submitted from the lab, back from the lab, that we're working on right now. We hope to have an answer on when this earthquake occurred and when these trees died within the next 6 months or so. So hopefully we'll get some decent results from that, and we'll be able to write another paper and talk more about what happened in southern Puget Sound. So let's see here. So some new stuff, and this is just mainly me waving my arms, and you can ask questions about it later on or during. So I want to first go and talk about some new stuff along the Seattle Fault Zone. So here's that original map I showed. We're going to look at the Seattle Fault Zone here. I put this in. This is a slide for this talk that I'm going to give at this meeting up in Anchorage next month. And so this diagram right here, these little bars are showing you the age range for all of the earthquakes that we know about on the Seattle Fault Zone. This is by far our most active fault in the region. Okay, we've got up to 9 earthquakes that we know about in the last 16,000 years on the fault zone. And you can see that in the last couple of thousand years, things got much more active than they were in the early part of the record. And so the recurrence intervals of earthquakes in this latter couple of thousand years, that's what we're looking about here. These boxes, the widths of these boxes are showing you the range of the recurrence of earthquakes, how often they occur in the last couple of thousand years. And so the earthquakes occur less than say 500 to maybe even less than a couple of dozen years. So the recurrence intervals of these earthquakes, these big earthquakes on the Seattle Fault, is much more frequent than we tend to hear about. It's a couple of hundred years is what we're looking about in terms of how often big earthquakes occur on the Seattle Fault. So I'm going to show you now some evidence for a very young rupture on the Seattle Fault Zone that we've got a paper that we're working on right now and hope to submit for publication in the next couple of weeks. So we're going to focus in on this part of Bainbridge Island. If you remember from the first part of the talk, I talked about the raised platform at Restoration Point. This is Restoration Point, and this is the raised platform that rings parts of southern Puget Sound. It rings the entire part of southern Bainbridge Island, rings the entire area over here on Waterman Point, over here in Kitsap Peninsula. You can see it as well. And so we've got this big uplifted platform. And then also we've got on this image, you can see the toe jam fault scarp here that we've trenched. There's a Waterman Point fault scarp here that we've trenched, and another one at Point Glover here, and one here at Islandwood, north of Blakely Harbor. So there's a lot of evidence for big uplift events here on southern in the central Puget Lowland associated with the Seattle Fault Zone. And then we've also got evidence for multiple surface ruptures, breaking where the fault tip actually breaks the ground surface and offsets the ground surface during the earthquake. And we're going to focus in on this area. This is an area that we've been looking at for a while. And you can see these little dark lines running through here on this image. Well, we think those are fault scarps. And so here they are blown up. I just zoomed in on that area of the previous image. And these are those little lines that I was pointing out. And you can see they run all the way across this area between West Blakely, Linwood Center on Bainbridge Island, and then over here by the end of Blakely Harbor. And so there's a feature that could be related to former earthquakes, past earthquakes, but we just need to look at them and figure out what's going on. And so we dug a trench across one of these features right over in here. And the other thing that caught my eye, this is what I just really got excited about, was when I first saw these things several years ago on the LiDAR, I've spent a lot of time looking at the uplifted platform. And I noticed that right here, you can see there's something going on with the shoreline here. There's another back edge. You can see where there's a back edge that's formed on the platform. That's the former high tide line. Well, you can see there's another back edge right here. You can see the drainages come down and they don't cut through further down. They just stop. So this is a former shoreline that basically comes up through here like this. And so I got really interested thinking, okay, well, there's been an area of uplift, small area of uplift here, similar to other small areas of uplift we've seen in this part of Bainbridge Island. And it could be associated with movement on these faults right here. And so we trenched and we got some samples of the material here on the terrace for radiocarbon dating. So here's the trench. I call this a pandemic trench. You can see this is West Johns here with his mask on, and these people are doing appropriate social distancing. This was at the height of the pandemic. We got permission to actually get out of the office and go do something as long as we were safe. And we got permission from the landowner, and we went out and we did a hand dug trench across this small scarp here in this person's backyard. And you can see his shed right here. He gave us permission to come in here and dig these hand dug trenches. And then you get in and we map these trenches in detail after we clean them down. And here's the little map we made of one of these trenches. And so here is the south part of the trench. Here's the north side of the trench. And here's the little fault scarp that we crossed right here. You can see how it rises from south to north. I mean, north to south. So this would be a scarp that's facing to the north rather than facing to the south, like most of the other scarps that we found on Bainbridge Island. So it's a really interesting feature. And what we found is we found bedrock and glacial tilled, older glacial deposits that were folded and warped. And we actually found a fault that was cutting up through these deposits here in this part of the trench, and little bit of offset, not a whole lot, not enough offset to account for the entire amount of the scarp here that we found. We found 2 buried soils. One of the buried soils was pretty old. This was about a 10,000-year-old buried soil. But the most intriguing part is we found a young buried soil that is at most a couple of 100 years old that we think is related to this latest episode of folding and faulting on the surface here. So the other thing we did, we got that. So we've got evidence for, possibly 2 earthquakes on this fault scarp in the last, 16,000 years or so, the youngest of which is pretty young in the last couple of 100 years. And then we've got this terrace out here, this uplifted terrace. And so here we went out on the uplifted terrace and we dug a couple of small test pits, and we were able to sample the sand and get little bits of charcoal out of the sand that were incorporated as detrital clasts within the sand deposit and date them. We also found evidence for where there were clams that were killed in growth position, and the outline that was called the pericardium was preserved, and we were actually able to see that in the subsurface. And so the radiocarbon samples on these test pits, they all indicate that the terrace was uplifted post 1865 CE. So within the last couple of 100 years. So we've got the trench that has a buried soil that couple of 100 years old. We've got this uplifted terrace that is at most a couple of 100 years old. We also have on the east end of this thing over here, we've got this thing called Mill Pond. Now, Mill Pond's an enigmatic thing. It's clearly been disturbed by people. You can see a little borrow pit here, and they enhanced the dam across the drainage. So it's clearly been enhanced by people. This was the site of the largest lumber mill in the world for a while. So there's no doubt that they had some people living in this area, and they were using this for drinking water. So here's what Mill Pond looks like. But you'll notice that there are these trees sticking up out of Mill Pond, most of which have not been cut. They rotted, and there's a couple that had been sawed off, but we don't see any evidence that these things were logged prior to death. And so we've also cored the sediments at the bottom of this pond because we couldn't rely on these trees. We didn't know enough about the area to know that they weren't just logged. But we did get dendro ages on these, and they were all killed right around the same time in the 1830s, 1820s. And so we've got cross dating that suggests that the trees died plus or minus 10 years around 1833. But we also have radiocarbon dates at the bottom of the deposits in the wetland, and they date the wetland was created several hundred years prior to people arriving, Europeans arriving in the area and settling in the area. So we knew there was a wetland there, and the wetland had been formed, and then the trees grew up, and then the trees were killed by some ponding event later on. Could have been human caused, may not have been human caused. We don't know yet. But we've got pretty decent evidence that the terrace was uplifted and the scarp folding event and faulting event that created a buried soil occurred in the last couple of hundred years at this site. So we're interpreting these 3 lines of evidence that there was a very young earthquake on the Seattle Fault, probably in the 1800s, was magnitude 6.5 or so. Wasn't huge, but it's big enough to cause a big shake for sure. So for us, it's very interesting because it's a very young earthquake that we've been able to document, the youngest earthquake we've been able to document on the Seattle Fault Zone. So I'm going to finish up by taking you on a quick tour of the North Olympic Fault Zone. Now, this one, if you live out on the peninsula, you can see here's the fault zone right here. Basically runs from just west of Crescent Lake Crescent, all the way through Port Angeles, just south of Port Angeles, and over to the area just south of Sequim. Now, this is the line that we've got mapped here. I've been spending quite a bit of time, and I can map it down to about right in here right now. And I'll show you some of that in just a bit here. So it's a pretty active fault. We've got maybe 5 events on the earthquake. You can see the studies here, mainly these trenches here along the scarp, 2 over here on what we call the Sadie Creek segment, and 2 over here on the Lake Creek boundary creek segment near Port Angeles. And when you lump them all together, you've got evidence for at least 4, maybe 5, if you believe this. I don't personally believe this, but the authors did, so I'm leaving it in there. So 4, possibly 5 events in the last 15,000 years or so. And they're probably magnitude 7, 7.5 events on this. If the whole fault ruptured, could be up to magnitude 7.5. Most recent is the last couple of thousand years. Oldest is late Pleistocene in age. You can see down here these box plots are showing you the recurrence intervals of the earthquakes, how often they occur. And so you have earthquake pairs that you calculate the return interval on. And you can see the return intervals are a little bit greater than 1,000 years to maybe up to 3,000 years. So the earthquakes are big, but they occur fairly infrequently on the fault, okay? But fairly regular activity though. So it's a pretty interesting fault. So what does this thing look like? So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a LiDAR tour. Here's a map of the fault. This is a LiDAR map of the fault. And these little pink lines, magenta lines, are the actual scarps that we've mapped on the LiDAR, using the LiDAR. And the orange dots are the places that we've actually gone and studied it with trenches, where we've dug trenches across the faults. So the next slide is that little box right here. We'll zoom in on that. Here's that little box. And so here's Sadie Creek, Susie Creek, and the Lyre River. Crescent Lake, the outlet of Crescent Lake is just off to the bottom right of this image. And the most striking thing on this image is you can see this little dark line running across, and it becomes light in places, right across the entire width of the image. And that is what we call the Sadie Creek Fault, the Sadie Creek segment. So again, this is a slope map for those looking and kind of wondering what the heck you're looking at. So it's a LiDAR image, and it's a slope map. So it's looking at the angle, how steeply sloping the surface is. That's what the map is showing you. Areas where it's flat is lighter colored. And so here's a ridge crest where the ridge is pretty flat. That's our ridge crest. And then the slopes coming off the ridge are darker because it's more steeply sloping. And so this is the kind of image I find these particularly useful in quickly assessing LiDAR images for fault scarps. And so that's why I show these things. And so here's the Sadie Creek Fault, very long linear fault scarp. It's interpreted as mainly a right lateral strike slip fault. And you can see places along here where the streams are apparently offset in a right lateral fashion. But I will say, just in terms of a overall, gestalt of the fault scarp, the reason you see the fault scarp there is because there was a significant vertical component of motion. That's why you see the scarp on the slope map. Is because there was a significant vertical offset of the ground surface during these earthquakes. We're going to zoom in on this spot right here so you can look at it in a little bit more detail. Again, here's a slope map. And so here is the fault scarp cutting across this alluvial valley. And it's very well expressed. It's a beautiful fault scarp. It's one of the best we've got out here. This side is up. This side is down. There's a wetland, a pond right here. And we trenched right in this area. This no, this isn't the trench, but it's trenched right in this area. And then the other trench is off the right of this image. You don't see it, but we have 2 trenches along this segment. And again, they're interpreting it as right lateral. You can see some of their evidence would be like this, where this stream segment is apparently right laterally offset. I can find things that are apparently not offset at all across the fault, just as often as we can find stuff that is apparently right laterally offset across the fault. So I think there's a little bit of wiggle room for interpretation on this, but most people think that it's primarily a right lateral strike slip fault system. And so let's go down. The next slide is going to be down on this part. This is just kind of due south of Squim, and your Port Townsend is right here, so not too far from your backyard. So we're going to zoom in on that slide there. And so again, there's a slope map. You can see ridge crests here, valley bottoms here. These white features are valley bottoms. Ridge crests are these narrow white features. Another ridge crest here. The logging roads are these white wiggly lines running across the map. Those are logging roads. They're white because they're flat features. But what I want to point you to is running across this image right along through here are these little things here that break the ground surface. Those, and I just mapped these this week. So those I think are fault scarps. And the interpretation is either they're fault scarps or what are called saccagens. And a saccagen is a place where there's a gravitational collapse of a ridge line. And I got a slide to show you what they look like. These are some saccans. Saccans is short for saccagen. This is what they look like. Here's a slope in just south of where I just showed you, maybe 35, 40 kilometers south of there. Here's a slope. This is a ridge crest. Here's a valley bottom. Here's a valley bottom. And here's the same ridge crest running along here. And so that's the top of a mountain. This is the mountainside. And you can see where these scarps are running from the bottom of the hill, the bottom of the mountainside, all the way to the top. You can see some all the way up here. And these scarps are facing uphill, and they are normal faults. And so they're basically showing where the mountain is basically gravitationally collapsing and pulling apart as it does. And so here's what they look like. Saccan is a group of linear morphological features. You can read that. I'm not going to read it for you, but here's kind of what they look like in cross section. And so facing upslope are these normal faults that the scarps are all facing upslope. So these are the scarps, the normal faults that core them, dip into the face of the mountain. So that's what they could be. They might not be. I think these guys up here, just because there tends to be a single linear feature, that tends to make me think it's not saccagen. These are clearly saccans. And I have no doubt about that. So a lot more work to be done on those. But interesting that we can potentially map the fault quite a bit further than it's been mapped previously. So I want to leave you with this. I always throw this in at the end because people always want to know, when's the next one? When's the next one? So this is courtesy of Art Frankel. He's retired from the USGS now. He basically was the brains, the architect behind the modern national seismic hazard maps for years. And Ralph, I was going to blame you for this. Art put this together years ago, gave it to me. And he said, think of this as kind of looking at it like this and laugh when you read these. Approximate 50-year probabilities for the 3 sources of earthquakes that we've got. So Cascadia, magnitude 9. He said there's a 10 to 14% chance of one of those in the next 50 years. That's nothing to sneeze at. That should put you on high alert. Seattle fault, magnitude 6.5 or greater. He says a 5%, and that's from the slip rates of the faults we know about, the Gutenberg-Richter model, and he estimated 1,000-year return time. This was done probably 20 years ago. So we know a lot more now, and we know the return time is now more like 250 years rather than 1,000, and could be between magnitude 6.4 to 7.5. And so it's probably more than 5% chance now. Deep earthquakes like the Nisqually earthquake, if you live here long enough, you are going to experience one of those. 84% chance you're going to experience one of those in the next 50 years. So the good news is that all of these earthquakes are included in the National Seismic Hazard Maps, the most recent version of which came out in 2023, just about 6 months ago, and is available free online if you're interested. and there's a lot of documentation behind it. And so I'm going to leave you with that. If you've got questions, you can ask, call, text, or email me. I don't mind, and we'll halt it there, and I'll take any questions you have.
Thank you, Brian. Why don't you
I'm trying to
sharing the
stop. There we
screen?
go. There we go.
There we go. And yeah, please, as Leslie put in text, in chat, put your questions in chat. I don't see any, but also raise your hand, and if you want to ask there. Um, I have a question on, since I don't see anything, let me start with one. The submergence, does that mean instant death for the tree, or because girdling a tree doesn't kill the tree the same year, it's usually the year after. And does it matter whether it's salt water or fresh water that the tree is submerged in killing it?
It depends on the tree, if it's a saltwater, freshwater problem. But most trees, I would say all trees, don't like salt water. So
Right.
if it's salt water, you're talking tree death, and it's going to be pretty quick. It's not going to last a year. It's going to die within a year. Certainly won't put on growth after that. Freshwater, there's trees that can get their feet pretty wet and don't mind. Cedar doesn't mind getting its feet a little wet. Spruce doesn't mind sometimes. Doug fir is generally not amenable to that. Most of the samples we've got are Doug fir. And so you're looking at trees that don't like getting their feet wet. And so even a freshwater submergence is going to kill these guys. Yeah. And at the types of submergence that we're looking at, they don't mind if their roots get a little wet. They don't like it if they're completely submerged. That's not going to happen. That's not going to work. Yeah, so it kills them pretty quick.
Thank you.
Ralph Dawes.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Do the fault offsets add up to Western Washington being squeezed against the backstop to the north? In general, yes. That's actually part of what I'm covering next month in my talk. So if we sum up all of the earthquakes that we've got in that box that covers basically the Salish Sea, the Salish Sea, the Puget Sound area, Puget Lowland area. We have 32 earthquakes in the last 16,000 years on all those, 9 or 10 faults. And what we know is that they tend to be more active in the south, less active in the north. And north of Vancouver, really north of the border, we don't see a whole lot of activity. So we have what I call it it's basically the Stillaguamish fault is what I'm going to call it. Stolamchuk fault, Stolamquamish fault. That's the Darrington, Devil's Mountain, Leech River fault now. So it's a fault that goes from Vancouver, British Columbia, all the way across the Straits of Georgia, hooks up to the Devil's Mountain Darrington fault for a big fault zone. And we have a long history of earthquakes on that. I think 4 or 5 earthquakes on that in the last 16,000 years. And that's about as far north as we see them right now. In general, I would say I can't say that the fault offsets add up because I don't think we've done that calculation yet. The moments, if you look at the moment release, the cumulative moment releases, they agree very well with what we would predict the moment releases to be from the seismic catalog and from the GPS. And so I think there's pretty good agreement in terms of moment release that we're getting basically what is predicted from GPS is accounted for in the faults that we've got in the lowland. I know it's a long answer, but yes, I think so. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. And Diane McDade asks, I used to hear that the big tsunami along the Seattle Fault was caused by an earthquake in Japan. I thought that was the same time frame as 923. I'm not sure.
Not for the tsunami deposit in the lowland. There are tsunami deposits out on the coast that are generated from Cascadia, but you might be thinking opposite of what's been thought, is that there was a big Cascadia earthquake in 1700 CE, so basically 300 years ago, and that triggered a big tsunami, which inundated parts of Japan. And that's how we got really down to the day timing for when that earthquake was, is because there were parts of Japan that were inundated by the tsunami, and they didn't know where the tsunami came from. And they're now thinking that it came from Cascadia.
Yeah, and often referred to as the orphan tsunami, I guess, because of.
Yeah. Okay, so Carol, can you speak to the Saddle Mountain Fault paralleling the thrust from the interior or the Olympics? And does the Saddle Mountain Fault cross Lake Cushman? So I think what you're talking about, the Saddle Mountain paralleling the thrust from the interior, is, so you've probably all heard of the Hurricane Ridge Fault. That's the big fault that's in the core of the Olympic Mountains, this big horseshoe-shaped fault that basically rings the Olympic Mountains and is in the core of the Olympics. And in general, the North Olympics Fault and the Saddle Mountain, what I call the Saddle Mountain Canyon River Fault system, basically parallel the Hurricane Ridge Fault system, but are outboard. In other words, they are north and east and south and east of the Hurricane Ridge Fault. So I tend to think of the Saddle Mountain and North Olympic Fault system as being the younger little brother of the Hurricane Ridge Fault system. So whether they're related or not, I have no idea. And so does the Saddle Mountain Fault cross Lake Cushman? I just alluded to that. I also call it the Saddle Mountain Canyon River Fault system. And so we've mapped it from across Lake Cushman. We've not mapped it in the lake, but we find the same fault on the southwest side of Lake Cushman. And we map it all the way out to the Wenatchee River Valley, where we've actually done some work on it out there. So yeah, we've mapped it a lot further than what is commonly shown on maps. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So Paul, curious about the Whidbey Fault. I didn't talk about the South Whidbey Island Fault, and partly because it has two earthquakes on it. It runs from basically North Bend through Woodinville, basically through Everett, across Whidbey Island, and then up into the Straits of Georgia. And it may or may not connect up with the Leech, the Stola-Guamish Fault. I'm not sure, but it has two earthquakes on it, not incredibly active. One earthquake is really old. One earthquake's about 2,700 years ago. But it did produce a pretty big earthquake, roughly 2,700 years ago. And that fault runs between, that active fault runs between Lake Hancock and Crockett Lake. And so we see that Crockett Lake got uplifted at the same time that Lake Hancock subsided at about the same time during this earthquake 2,700 years ago. So that offset in the shoreline is what we think was caused by activity on that fault. I didn't talk about it. I had to pick a fault to talk about. So I picked the North Olympics. I take it from your response to my previous question that the earthquake moments include rotation across the region, consistent with GPS. We can't get rotation from the paleo earthquake record. I wish we could. And so I think, are you talking about the block model from Ray Wells? And if you are, then I would say that what we're coming up with is consistent with what they came up with in terms of the moment rate of earthquakes across the region, because their model is consistent with the GPS. And what we're finding from the moment release from the paleo earthquakes is that it's consistent with what we would get from the GPS. So yeah, I would say that it is consistent with that. Yeah. I hope that answered your question, Ralph. That's a hard one to get at, but yeah, in general, that's my talk for the SSA meeting up in Anchorage next month. Is kind of, what are we looking at here? And it basically, the paleo record agrees really well with the seismic catalog rate and the GPS rate. Yeah. So Jeff Tepper, are there any historic examples of multiple faults failing simultaneously on the scale you're suggesting? Actually, it's more the norm than the exception. I can name many: Landers, Denali, Kaikoura, the recent earthquake in Ridgecrest, the earthquake in Turkey. I mean, just about every big earthquake we know about is one of these multi-fault earthquakes. Like I said, it's more the norm than the exception now. So I have no qualms whatsoever about two faults rupturing at the same time. Yeah, it's so common that we don't even blink an eye now. So Kaikoura, the New Zealand earthquake, ruptured, we think, 22 faults at the same time. 22. That's just mind-blowing if you ask me. So yeah, it can happen. So I live in Squim. Does that fault follow Highway 101 through that area? It's south of Highway 101 through there. Yeah. And I spent, because I'm giving you the talk today, I basically.
Yeah, I'm up on a talk.
I'm sorry, what? You're up on the top? I spent all day looking at LiDAR, and I don't particularly see a fault north of 101 in that area. I'm looking. There's some people that think there's a fault north of near where the Manus Mastodon site is. I don't believe it, but we'll see. They're going to trench it. We'll see. I do think that the North Olympics fault does follow just south of 101 and starts to bend to the south. I think we've got pretty decent evidence that there's something going on there. It needs to be sussed out in the field, and we need to do some work on the actual scarps, but there's something there to work on. So yeah, I think it does. Yeah.
Thank you, Brian. We had as many as 51 sign in, and Michael, you have Bill Nessie and Jim Elliott and other Colorado contingents following you here. So if you could all unmute yourself and thank Brian, much appreciated. I guess
You're
that
welcome.
concludes our meeting, and we'll see you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Brian.
Brian.
Excellent talk.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Thank you. I
you.
hope you guys got
Thank you
something.
so much.
A
Thank
lot
you.
more. Thank you. That was really great, Brian. The additions had. I'm glad that I mentioned something about Little Skookum Inlet.
Yeah, more local flavor. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and the North Olympic fault zone is pretty important too. So
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well,
I
it's your
have-
backyard.
A final question
Sure.
is the Pat Williams that you mentioned, do you know if he went to Evergreen State College? Is he local
I have no-
Washingtonian?
I have no idea. He was at Lamont Daugherty. He worked for Gordon, so it might be a different guy. I don't know.
Might
I
be.
don't know. Actually, we're looking for him, so we want to. He knows where some of these trees. He has the original field notes, and we want them.
I may know that Pat Williams. I'll look into it.
Okay, dude. If it was him, if he used to work with Gordon Jacoby, let me know. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
I
he
will.
lives across Jeff lives across the street from me, Brian, so I'll be sure to get it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
take care.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And this is recording will be